Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Samantha Johnson, and I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement at the Leeds School of Business. We're excited to have Jane Miller presenting on the art of giving and receiving feedback for today's webinar. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Jane, please send a question through the chat interface. I will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Jane will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will be in touch with you. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants later today, along with a survey link. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Jane Miller is a 30-year food industry executive with experience working with startups and Fortune 500 companies. She is the founder of JaneKnows.com, a career advice website geared towards young leaders starting their careers, and the author of Sleep Your Way to the Top and Other Myths About Business Success, a sassy business book targeted at millennials. Currently, Jane is the CEO of Hannah Max Cookie Chips, and previously, Jane was the CEO and president of Proyo and also Charter Baking Company. Over the course of her career, Jane was part of an executive team that brought Hostess out of bankruptcy, worked for H.J. Heinz as the Chief Growth Officer, and then the president of the UK and Ireland division, and she ran the Western division of Best Foods Baking. The first 14 years of her career were at PepsiCo, where she rose to be the president of the Central Division of Frito-Lay. Jane currently serves on the University of Colorado Leeds School of Business Board of Alumni and Friends, and in 2015, Jane established the Jane Knows Scholarship Fund at Leeds, supporting students who are the first in their family to go to college. This past fall, she was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Leeds School of Business. Jane has a degree from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and an MBA from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Jane. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Sam. It's my pleasure to be on this webinar today. Everyone, this is my first webinar, so hopefully I'll be able to represent some of this material as well as I believe I can in person. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about the art of giving and receiving feedback. And as Sam went through my whole career, after 30-some years in the food business, I have really learned a lot of lessons about the importance of feedback and how hard it is to receive feedback and how hard it is to give feedback. And what I'd like to do over the next 40 minutes or so is just tell you a couple stories from my career, give you just a little bit of advice on a number of topics, and I would love to field questions that you might have about the topic. So I'll start navigating the presentation. Although Sam took you through my background, I will just kind of give you a quick visual of some things that I've done for anybody on the call that is wondering about their career and how they move forward based on maybe what your undergraduate is. I would like to reassure everyone that I have a Russian studies degree from Knox College, and have, despite that, as my liberal arts background, I think have been very successful in the business world. I went on to SMU and got my MBA, and following from that, went to PepsiCo, Heinz, Best Foods, did a little stint in the computer industry at Gateway, Hostess, Rudy's, and a startup called Proyo. So have a lot of experience in a lot of different industries. Today, I am the CEO of a private equity-backed company called Hannah Max Cookie Chips. It's a great, fun brand, non-GMO, cage-free eggs, hormone-free butter, and just something that's really going to disrupt the cookie aisle, I think, with a better-for-you product that tastes amazing. I do spend a lot of my time outside of running the company in a mentoring role. I think early in my career, I was always a little afraid to ask anyone to be a mentor and sort of felt like I needed to be a bit of a superhero, and as such kind of navigated a lot of the waters of my career by myself. And at this point in my career, what I really believe strongly in and would say to everybody on the call, that you really need to reach out to a number of people to be mentors or on your personal advisory board, because so many of the things that you'll experience in your career and that we'll talk about in terms of feedback today are things that would be so much more helpful if you weren't trying to figure them out by yourself. So maybe after this call, if you have the opportunity to go on my website, janeknows.com, it's a free advice place to go to get all kinds of tips on things like feedback, like we're talking about today, but even things like writing a resume, dealing with horrible bosses, getting fired from a job, just kind of the range of topics that you might run into in the workforce. I'm also do a little bit of speaking just for fun on the side, and as Sam mentioned, I'm the author of this book, Sleep Your Way to the Top and Other Myths About Business Success. The reason I want to highlight this book in the presentation was in case anyone had Googled me. I usually get two responses. I either get the first response is someone laughs when they see the title of the book and they get the joke. And the other response is I have someone who's horrified by the fact that someone with my experience would actually write a book called Sleep Your Way to the Top. And so what I'd like to do before we get into the guts of this presentation is tell you why I wrote this book and where the title came from. What I found was that although technology has changed and jobs have changed in the 30-plus years since I started my career, the thing that hasn't changed is how people treat one another. There are petty people and mean people and horrible bosses and politics in the office and all kinds of things that are very difficult to learn when you're in school, that you actually need to get into the working world to experience them. And what I found was, whether it was 30-some years ago or today, a lot of the same conditions still existed. And what I wanted to do was put it all in one place, kind of an advice book that would be fun and a little irreverent. So it wouldn't be old, boring CEO, blah, 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 about all of our experiences, but instead to maybe look a little bit under the sheets in terms of some of my experiences and some of the harder things that I've dealt with. And one of the things, which is really the reason why I titled the book Sleep Your Way to the Top, came from an experience in my career. I was at Frito-Lay, and I had been in marketing, and I had decided to pursue an opportunity in a general management position. And those positions had typically been run by males in the organization, and they were quite coveted. And I was really the first woman from marketing that had ever put her kind of hat in the ring on this. And so it was a little bit of a stretch, a little bit of a chance, because I didn't have all the qualifications, but I really felt that this was the thing I wanted to do next in my career. And what happened was I actually got the job, and it was based in Memphis, and covered the territory of Louisville, Nashville, Memphis, and Little Rock. And when I got the job, the rumor that went around was that I must have slept with somebody to get the position. And the rumor was, as it turned out, started by someone who wanted the job, because no one could really understand how a gal from marketing that didn't have any sales background could get this sort of prestigious position. And the reason why it always stuck with me was I was a very confident young woman, but when this actually happened and the rumor went around about me sleeping with somebody, it at the time really kind of shook me to the core, because I really was shocked that someone would actually say that, because I knew that I might not have had all of the qualifications, but I knew that I had all the potential to do the job. And so that always stuck with me. And so the book, if you have a chance to read it, it's on Kindle and paperback, and if you love my voice after 40 minutes of this webinar, you can get the audiobook for 5.5 hours of hearing me talk, is really all about confidence and about building your confidence and what that can do for you in your career, which is a terrific segue into what we're going to talk about today, because confidence, if that's sort of the core of who we are and how we're successful in business, feedback is a very, very key tool to be able to build that confidence. So I'm going to talk today about two categories. One is receiving feedback, and I'm going to give you two stories from my career about direct feedback that I was given, and then some indirect feedback that I was given and what I did with that, and then give you some tips on, if you're in the role of providing someone else with feedback, how you can be most effective in that. So why is receiving feedback important? We are going to launch a little poll here before I go forward, and these will be the questions that Sam will be sending to you, and we'd love to have your participation.
Great, so we'll go ahead and launch that poll now. So go ahead and make your selection. Great, it looks like we have almost half of you who have submitted your selection, we'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds here. All right, in just a few more seconds. And great, we'll go ahead and close the poll here. So it looks like, Jane, we have winning at 56%. Folks said that receiving feedback is important because it lets you know where you stand with your boss, and then coming in second at 44%, it gives you power.
That's great. That's thanks, Sam. That's an awesome segue then into my slide, which is, I think I need to get the screen back though. Hold on.
Yep, and Jane, you've got the screen back, so you are good.
Okay, for some reason it's not moving. Oh, there we go. So actually, of all the different choices, I would suggest that it gives you power to be able to decide if you want to adjust your style or not. So let me give you a couple examples about this, and this is about receiving feedback, and then we'll get into giving feedback a little bit later. So let me get to the next slide. Actually, we'll come back to this. So here's a story from my career. I had started at Frito-Lay. I mentioned about writing my book, but way before that, having sort of the reputation of having slept my way to the top. I had started in marketing, as I said, and had been very successful. And Frito-Lay at the time was a company that was one that was it was based in Dallas, very informal, super friendly, just not, I would say not unprofessional, but not rigid, not overly serious. And so as I started my career at Frito, it was this kind of informal environment that I absolutely excelled at. And after I'd been there for a few years, I had the opportunity to transfer up to Pepsi-Cola, which was a sister division within the PepsiCo organization. And when I went to PepsiCo, it was based in New York, it was a little bit more formal. Everyone was a little bit more serious. Everybody, soft drinks is a very serious business, as you might imagine. And everything was, I would say, a bit more buttoned up than it was at Frito. And so where I'd been really successful at Frito-Lay, when I went to Pepsi, it felt like I was talking and that people were not listening to me. And I was really frustrated with this because I'd been very successful and I came to Pepsi and was not seeing the same kind of success. And so one day, the senior vice president of my division invited me into his office, and I did what I always did whenever I sat down with somebody, whether it was one of my peers, a senior person, or maybe even talking to the janitor in the hall. I would talk about what I did over the weekend and ask them about their weekend and be super friendly and very, very chatty. And that was my style, and it had been very successful up until that point in time. Well, in this particular incident, the senior vice president was pretty much stoic as I was kind of babbling on about my weekend and my hike with my dogs. And he said, Jane, we think you have a lot of potential. And of course, imagine if you're sitting there across from your senior vice president, and he's telling you have a lot of potential, you kind of sit up tall in your chair, and the little bubble over your head is like, well, finally, somebody's recognizing the great potential that I have. And as I'm sitting there, he then says, we think you have potential, but there's a problem. And of course, the immediate little bubble over your head is, what could the problem possibly be? And he goes on to say, the problem is with your style. And I'm thinking, my style? What could possibly be wrong with my style? And he goes on to say, we think you have potential. We believe you have a problem with your style, but what we'd like to do is send you 3 days one-to-one with a psychologist to work on your style. Now, at this point, imagine if you're sitting there and you're trying to think about how you respond to that, because someone is basically telling you that you need to go work one-to-one with someone because your style is not working in the company. And for those of you that are familiar with the term Stepford wife, all I could think about was they wanted me to become some kind of a robot or some sort of person that was not going to be myself. And I was really a bit taken aback, and I went home and said to my husband, I don't know if I should do this or not. This is they want to change me. They want to make me into something that is different. And his response was so very, very helpful to me, because what he said was, they obviously think you have potential. It must cost a bunch of money to spend time with this psychologist. Why don't you go and spend a couple of days, and then you can decide. And so I did. And what I learned in the couple of days that I spent with Marty Seldman, PhD, was a lot about different styles. And so what you see on your screen right now there's all kinds of different metrics, and probably many of you have taken different personality tests. But this was the one that was used in my time with Dr. Seldman. And what it lays out is sort of this grid of responsiveness versus assertiveness. And what I found was that in the corporate world, a lot of the people that I was working for were really drivers. So they were in this top right-hand box. And these would be someone, and perhaps many of you have worked for, or you find yourself in this category, which is you're very goal-oriented. You are very serious. You are, in a lot of ways, want to get right to the point, and don't want someone like me, who is more in this expressive kind of category, that I would come in and start talking about my dogs and everything that was happening in my life, where you really didn't want to hear that. And so what I found by spending some time with Dr. Seldman was a better understanding of different personality types and how they really respond to different cues that you have. And the best way for me to describe this to you is this. I was speaking French, and at PepsiCo, the senior management was all speaking German. So at Frito-Lay, we were all speaking French, and I got along just perfectly well because everyone spoke my language. But then when I went to Pepsi, everybody was speaking German, and the louder that I spoke French, and the more that I spoke French, the less people would listen to me. And this was a really, really critical learning for me in terms of feedback, because this direct feedback that I got about my style was absolutely critical for me to understand a couple of things. One, that I wasn't speaking the same language as the company, and two, that if I wanted to be successful, I needed to learn that language. So when we did the poll, I asked about power. What I learned from this situation was that by knowing what my issue was with the company, I had the power to decide if I wanted to fix it or not. I get a lot of questions from people that are in sort of similar situations in their career about wanting to be authentic, wanting to be very much themselves in the corporate environment. And what I would say to you is, if you get feedback, you are the one that becomes in control. So by knowing that I wasn't speaking the right language within the company, I was able to very quickly sort of say, do I want to change my style, or do I want to leave the company? Or do I want to stay at the company and keep speaking French when everyone speaks German? Now, for me, what I decided to do was to say, when I lead a company, which I have for the last number of years, I'm going to always speak French, because that is my style, that's my language. But as long as I was at the Pepsi-Cola company, I actually flexed my style to be able to speak German. And the power here about receiving feedback is this, which is putting myself in control, having me be the one that has the power to make the decision about whether or not I change my style. So as you're hearing me say this, what I would say to everyone on the call, you don't have to become a different person. You just have to understand how your style impacts other people. Because if you want to operate in a corporate environment, you need to speak the language of the people that are in that company. So this is very, very direct feedback, of which I took to heart. The next story I'd like to tell you about in my career is one about receiving indirect feedback. We're not always going to necessarily be lucky enough to have someone like I had in this situation at Pepsi, where someone will give you direct feedback. Well, they will tell you what your issues are, and in some cases, you need to read between the lines. So I'd like to tell you a story from a little bit later in my career, where I was giving very, very clear, indirect feedback, and I was not sort of reading the tea leaves. So just as a visual here, I was the president of Heinz in London. And to kind of put that in perspective, at the time it was about a $1.5 billion business. It was the second largest division at Heinz. Heinz in the UK, if you've been over there, it's kind of a combination of companies. It's ketchup, as you know. It's beans. So imagine in the US, if you had Heinz ketchup, Bush's beans, Campbell's soup, Gerber baby food, Smart Ones, frozen entrees, all of those under one company. That was the Heinz company in London. And I was really quite privileged to be the CEO of that, or the president of that company. Well, when I went over there, there was the head of sales, and he was a Brit. And the guy didn't actually work out very well for the company. And so it was time to look for another second in command, or the VP of sales. And so I said to the chairman of the company that I really wanted to get another Brit to move into that role. Even though the previous guy hadn't done a very good job, I felt that a Brit would be really terrific, since I was an American, and there's a lot of cultural nuances when you have a chance to work in another country. The chairman, though, at the time felt very strongly that he had a guy that would be the perfect guy for me. He was actually an American, and he had a great track record in the U.S. And so the kind of the discussion with me and the chairman went like this. The chairman said to me, Jane, I have someone that I think would be the perfect person for you in this job to be your second in command, to be the VP of sales. And I said, well, thank you very much, but I have somebody, I'd really like to do a search here in the UK. And the chairman said to me, well, you know, this is totally your decision, but I really have someone I'd like for you to consider. And I said, well, you know, thank you very much. I know who you're talking about. I think he's a great guy, but I would really like to find someone who was here in the UK. Well, without exaggerating this or saying this too many times back and forth, the indirect feedback that I was getting from the chairman and CEO of the company was that he wanted me to take this VP of sales. Me, I kind of drew a line in the sand and basically said, no, I am not going to do that. Because I'm an American, I really want to hire a Brit to come in and be my second in command. And what happened in this situation was that I actually did end up hiring that VP from the U.S. that the chairman wanted me to hire. But during this process of me putting a line in the sand on something that I didn't need to put a line in the sand on, the company really lost confidence in me. And although I wasn't fired, I was asked to move into another position outside of the UK, back in the US. And at that point, it was kind of the equivalent of being put in the corner with a dunce cap. And instead of accepting that, I actually left the company. And so I think it's kind of a painful story for me to share, but I think it's an important one, because I was getting it was indirect feedback in terms of what I should have done, but I wasn't paying attention to what the chairman was saying. Instead, I felt so strongly and had such a strong opinion that I really put a line in the sand and made a decision that was, I think, in the long term, not the right one for me, but that was the decision that I made. And so in this particular situation, what I'd say is that I really lost the power in this example, because I was not paying attention to what the boss was saying. So when I talk about the first piece of feedback, about getting direct feedback, it's very important, because then you can decide one way or another, in my example at Pepsi, about whether you want to change your style. In this particular situation, I believe that I lost my power because I wasn't listening to what he was saying. It really wasn't, in the whole scheme of things, that important for me to have a Brit in that job. But for some reason, I made it more important than it needed to be. And because of that, I lost my power. So as you think about receiving feedback, sometimes it's really hard. I mean, all of us love to get feedback that you're doing a great job, you're a superstar, you're really wonderful. But what is really hard to listen to, whether it's direct or indirect, is when you're not doing such a great job. And in my experience, you actually learn more about when you're not doing a great job, what you can do better, than when you're just getting patted on the back for the great, great stuff that you do. So with that, I do have a few tips that I'd like to share with you and there's also a handout on this that you can download after the webinar. But let me just kind of walk through a couple of key tips. If somebody is giving you feedback, and specifically feedback maybe that is difficult for you to hear. The first one is to listen objectively. And my tip here is you almost have to sort of move yourself out of your body so that you don't take it so personally. When I was younger in my career, whenever I got any kind of feedback that was negative or constructive, I would immediately feel like I needed to cry, because I really was trying so hard to be good that it was and to be great at my job. It was really hard if somebody gave me feedback that was not supporting how great I was. And what I found is a really good tool is if you really try to listen to what they're saying, and not in a way that you're trying to process it in any other way than just hearing their exact words. So again, think about listening as objectively as you possibly can, because it'll help you sort of strip out the emotions of it. Make sure you take notes. One of the things is that I know for myself and for a lot of people that I've given feedback to in the past is that sometimes you only want to listen to the things that you want to hear, and sometimes it's very, very helpful if you actually take notes of what's being said so that you don't walk away one way or another. I mean, you actually see two extremes. Sometimes if someone's getting a hard message and you actually give them one compliment in the course of that, they only walk away with the compliment. Other times, if you're giving somebody lots of compliments and one negative, they only walk away with the one negative. And I think depending on the person who's giving you the feedback, how you feel about them, whether you trust them or respect them, that you might take the feedback in different ways. So I would say always take notes, because again, especially if it's an emotional discussion, it's very hard to be able to be objective about it, and taking notes really, really helps. I would also say my third tip is to, absorb what's being said, but don't become confrontational. What I would say in my experience is that it's hard to give difficult feedback, and it's even harder if the person that you're giving it to is really responding in an emotional way or actually in a confrontational way. So I would say if you are the person who is receiving the feedback, make sure you're just taking it in. Again, you're listening objectively, you're taking notes, and you're trying to make sure that you understand everything that this person is saying, as opposed to trying to refute each point that comes up. I would say that another great tip is to make sure that you're asking questions and asking for examples. I'll talk about this in a few minutes when I talk about actually giving good feedback. The questions are absolutely critical for clarification and making sure that you understand specifically what somebody is saying to you. And again, come across as confrontational, but instead that you're trying to get clarification about different examples, because you're trying to learn from this, not trying to debate it. What I would also say is it's great to take it all in and then ask to schedule another meeting where you can follow up after you've had a chance to think about this. Because again, when you're getting feedback that is difficult to understand or to sort of take in, what you don't want to do is just respond on the cuff. So basically, my last point there was that after you've kind of taken all of this in, to make sure that you schedule another meeting, to not feel like you have to react at that very moment. This is just such an important thing, because again, generally when you're getting constructive feedback, it is better to be able to process it and to be able to get back with your boss at a later point and be able to chat. And when you've also had a chance to sort of take it in and think about putting a plan together on that. So again, don't feel like you need to have answers right on the spot. I think making sure that you are very thoughtful about how you respond to the feedback. I would also say to also be just very gracious about having received feedback, even if it is difficult. And we'll perhaps talk at the end about if you find yourself getting emotional in a meeting, how you kind of deal with that. So I would say that, again, receiving and processing feedback is really, there is definitely an art to this. And just remember that the person who's giving you difficult feedback is generally just as hard for them to give it as it is for you to receive it. So with that, let's move on to the other side of the coin, which is let's talk about what kind of feedback. We'll do a little first about what kind of feedback do you wish you received, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it's like to actually give feedback and how you can have some good tips around that. So let's launch a poll.
All right, and so the question is, what kind of feedback do you wish you received? So we'll give everyone a few moments here to answer. Great, and it looks like we've got half, so we'll give everyone a few more seconds here. All right, last couple seconds. All right, and thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and close the poll now. So Jane, it looks like in the lead we have at 56% that individuals wish they had received more specific feedback versus generalizations. And then following in second is more examples about how you could do a job better and more honest feedback, not sugar-coated.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. That's
Yep.
really, really terrific. I love this, being able to do a poll to kind of get what your reactions are to that. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about providing good feedback, and it really builds off of the response of many of you on the poll. The first thing I would say is looking for consistent themes, not a one-off problem. This is, I think, a very important thing about feedback is that what you don't want to do, all of us have bad days. And all of us are going to do things that are, maybe not 100% on our best behavior or the most politically correct way to handle something or the most professional. So you're going to run into that quite a bit. But I think there's a difference between having a bad day and then consistently having an issue that needs to be addressed. And so one of the things that I would say is if you want to give feedback to someone on your team, is to make sure that this isn't just a bad day, that in fact it is a consistent theme. And this is going to be able to help you, I think, give better feedback. Specifically, if you go to the next one, which is having concrete examples, not generalizations. This is absolutely important because just being able to say that someone's not a team player or someone's not showing initiative, those don't help anybody because it doesn't give them enough information to be able to act differently. And so I think it's really, really important that you have very concrete examples of what you're talking about and be as specific as you possibly can, because most of us really respond better to more facts versus generalizations. And this actually goes back to a bit of the example that I'd given about the four different personality types: the driver, the expressive, the analytic, and the amiable. What I find, regardless of the personality that you are working with, is making sure that you are trying to be as fact-based as possible, because all of us, even if you're super expressive like me, you always should have a common denominator of facts. That's really the best way to be able to operate. The third thing is creating a safe environment for the discussion. What you don't want to be doing is giving someone negative feedback in a large group. You don't want to be doing it in front of a lot of other people. I think that this is a very respectful thing to be able to sit down in a very more private environment so that somebody can have the response that they want to have. And so for this, let me give you a quick story. I was, another story from when I was at Pepsi, I was the Mountain Dew brand manager. And for those of you on the phone that have worked in big companies, you know that if you're going to be presenting to the most senior management of the large company, you don't go in with a rogue presentation, that in fact you have had many people that have vetted your presentation before you present. And in my case, I was going to be presenting the Mountain Dew brand plan. And as the brand manager, there were probably about 5 layers of management between me and the most senior person that I will be presenting to. And every person had actually seen my presentation in advance of me presenting the annual plan. And so I went into the plan presentation feeling extremely confident for a number of reasons. One, everyone had approved the presentation. Another reason was that the soft drink category had been pretty much flat, and Mountain Dew had been declining over a number of years. And in my presentation, I was going to present that Mountain Dew was going to grow at 15% the next year. And so the combination of having the confidence of 5 layers of management, having presented this or having approved the presentation, knowing that the brand had been declining and I was going to be the one saying to senior management that it was going to grow at 15% the next year, I was very, very confident about what I was going to be presenting. And so I had an hour presentation, and my first slide to the group, imagine a big conference room filled with people in suits, probably 30 people, of which maybe a large number had already seen and approved the presentation. I start out, and my first slide, I say, in 1989, Mountain Dew is going to grow at 15%. And of course, waiting sort of for the applause from the audience, because that was going to be quite a big growth number for the company for the next year. Instead, the most senior person in the room said in front of everyone, "Jane, how can you look yourself in the mirror with a number like that? As soon as we get finished with this presentation, I'm going to find someone to take your place, someone that will grow this business at more than 15% next year." Now, imagine if you're me, having come into the presentation, assuming that you've got it nailed, and then being told that within 1 minute of your slide and you have another 60 minutes left or 59 minutes left in your presentation. You know, there's a lot of different things you could do. You could, what I wanted to do was start crying, but what I did do was just finish the presentation because I had practiced it a million times, and then I went to the nearest stairwell and started crying, but I did make it through the presentation. But I share this example because what it turned out was that the more senior guy was really testing me to some degree. He felt that I, again, had some potential, but that I wasn't really necessarily tough enough for the environment at Pepsi, and he was going to sort of put that on display. And I learned a lot of things coming out of that, but one of the key things that I've learned is where and when you give people feedback. And it's not doing it in a public place where someone is feeling quite embarrassed and humiliated and has to very quickly respond on their feet in a very professional way, but you give someone the opportunity to be in a private setting so that they can respond appropriately. So really creating a safe environment for a discussion is really, really important. And the next piece of it is not expecting an action plan on the spot. Again, almost like receiving feedback, the same as with providing good feedback. Allow someone to not have to respond. Allow them to take in what you're saying to them. Allow them to come back to you with an action plan, because again, constructive feedback can be very, very hard to be able to take. And then finally, again, it's almost like giving concrete examples. If you could provide some thought starters on how improvement can happen. So we'll say that in the case of my Mountain Dew presentation, if this guy would have said to me in a private meeting, would have said, you know, Jane, 15% is not going to be acceptable in this company. You need to have at least a 20% growth plan. What I'd ask you to think about is how can we build better distribution? What should we be doing from a marketing standpoint? Should we be doing more demos of the Diet Mountain Dew products? Should we be doing display contests for our salespeople? But give some thoughts, because as the more senior person and the person giving feedback, you have some ideas about what they can do to be more successful, and share those so that that way they leave there feeling not only have you given them feedback, but you actually want to give them a leg up in terms of being able to do something to be successful with the feedback that you've given them. So with that, what I would say is, let me close, and then I'd love to answer any questions that might be coming from the audience, is when I think about feedback, I just would say give you 2 pieces of advice, which is receive it graciously and give it kindly. I think one of the key things about feedback is if you really care about the person that you're giving the feedback to, that it is really coming from a place of wanting them to be more successful, that you will be able to give feedback that will be received in the way in which it was intended. And likewise, if you're the person receiving feedback, feeling that in fact someone is giving it to you because they want you to have the power to be in control of how you respond to something versus something just happening to you. And I think this is one of the most important things about a successful career, is building confidence and being in control of the decisions that you make. And feedback will only help you be better in being in control. So with that, Sam, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Jane. And just as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions panel in your attendee control panel. So Jane, we do have a question here. It says, what can we do to solicit feedback? So sometimes we end up receiving direct feedback only once a year or during a review, but if someone is looking to improve all the time, how do they make people feel comfortable with giving them feedback?
So that's just a terrific question, and I think there's kind of a fine line, because you don't want to every time you talk say, hey, can you give me feedback on that? Because you want it to be something that is more thoughtful, and also something that is probably not quite as frequent, so you don't come off as being high maintenance. What I would say is generally the good time to get feedback, again, outside of the formal review, is after you have finished a project. So for example, let's say that you've just done a big analytical project that you've turned into your boss, to after they have reviewed that, to ask them to give you specific feedback on what worked and what didn't work, not just say, hey, you did a great job, but in fact maybe dig into a little bit more detail, again, going back to this idea about specifics. I think one place to really ask for feedback is if you're giving a presentation. A lot of times we are so wrapped up in what we're presenting that we're not always thinking about how we can answer questions or how we could even come across maybe a little more professional. And sometimes, a lot of times, I know people, when you give presentations, you're just like happy to have them over with because they're a little bit nerve-wracking. So I think thinking about a moment where you've done something where you think that you would really like to hear how you've done, and both the good and also the bad. And I would also solicit that feedback, from someone that you trust, and maybe not someone necessarily who is your direct report, if you have that opportunity, or your direct boss, if you have that opportunity. So you could have someone that was perhaps more of a bystander, maybe someone who's even a little bit more objective that can give you feedback.
Great, thank you,
Another
Jane.
question?
And we have, yeah, we've got lots of questions. It's great. So another question for you: how do you handle an individual who believes that they already know it all and who basically refuses to listen to feedback? And then that question, and if you have any advice for different generations.
Okay, gosh, those are two big questions. So the know-it-all that's really, really tough, especially if, let's assume that the know-it-all is someone that works for you. Maybe we'll start with that, if it's the know-it-all that works for you. And I think, basically, again, I would use very, very concrete examples, and I would also be very direct, honestly. So if this is someone who works for you and feels like they know everything, and you're sitting there trying to give them feedback, and they're kind of like, oh, whatever, I've already got this totally nailed, I would be that honest, and I would say, let me just say that you're doing it. I think you're doing a great job. You have a lot of things that are working really well for you. But I have to say, and I've actually had to give this feedback to somebody, because I've actually had people work for me that are so doggone smart that in fact they are know-it-alls, but like nobody wants to work with a know-it-all, even if you are that person. So I've actually had to sit down with someone and say, you know what, you may be the smartest gal or guy in the room, but the best way to be able to work with other people is to listen and to be empathetic, and not feel like you have all the answers. Because even if you do have all the answers, that does not bring out the best in other people. So what I would do is basically, in the way that you're most comfortable with, say, hey, one, being a know-it-all, even if you are, is not the best way to bring out the best in others. And I think, most know-it-alls that I have worked with, if they do feel that they are that way, they also want to make sure that they can communicate better with others. So I would say just being direct, and again, maybe giving some examples that you're very comfortable with in terms of when they've come across as that. And so one example in my particular case was somebody that would ask a question for the answer, and somebody would answer it, and he would be like, yeah, that's not the right answer, here's the right answer. And you kind of go, why did you even ask the question if you already knew the answer, right? And so I think trying to get sort of that sense that, knowing the answer doesn't help in terms of really kind of building teamwork or other people being able to respond. So I would say, again, maybe in a nutshell on that, just being frank with the know-it-all, that in fact, whether they are that person or not, that it doesn't help from a team standpoint because no one likes that one person has all the answers. And to the cross-generation thing, it's interesting because I have done a lot of work with millennials, and I'm a baby boomer, as you might imagine from my career experience. And what I found across generations is equally listening. So not assuming just because I'm older that I've got all the answers and that somebody who's new in their career doesn't. This concept that everybody has something to add, whether you've got 35 years of experience or maybe 2 days on the job, all of us bring our own unique life experiences and skills to a job. And so what I would really suggest as you speak across generations is offer every person the respect that you would want to be given to yourself, and realizing that not everyone has the same experience, but everybody has a valued point of view. And I think a lot of people in my generation, we overlook that because we dismiss someone with less experience versus somebody with more experience. So I think if you kind of keep in mind, regardless of who you're talking to, they have a valued opinion, I think that will really help speaking across generations.
Great, thank you, Jane. And we've received a couple questions about giving feedback to your manager, to other senior management leaders. So the question is, how do you give feedback to your boss or to senior management? Is it the same as what you've been talking about, or are there different techniques that are helpful?
Well, it's a little trickier just because the nature of big companies is that feedback generally starts at the top and goes down. I think, and that's kind of the reality of it. But what I would say is the best way to give feedback to someone who is more senior than you is to put it in the context of work. Put it in the context of you doing a better job. And so let's maybe use an example. Let's say with me, I know from my own management style, sometimes I am more general than I should be. I'm like the best person to work for if you're a really good employee, and probably not the best person if you need a lot of direction. And so I think if there was someone who was working for me that felt that I wasn't giving them enough direction to be able to do their job, what I would want them to say is, the feedback that I want them to give me is something along the lines of, hey, Jane, I think I could do a better job and we could move this project forward if you could be more specific in your instruction to me, because I feel like you're too general and it's not helping us really as a team to figure out, what's the best way to conquer this particular subject. Or in the case of style, it could be that we'll say in my case that maybe I came across as being too hard on somebody or maybe way too overreactive. I think what would be great, again, it's definitely more of an art if you're trying to manage up, but be able to say to me, hey, Jane, in that particular situation, I think that maybe you overreacted on that. And I think, again, I think as a company, we would be able to get better results if we kind of all took in the information a little bit more objectively, just because it just, I think for our team, it would be better for you to be able to be a little bit more objective about it. And so if you think about it, I think, again, it's one, understanding if the person is open to feedback. Because in some cases, the reality of it is you may have a boss that really doesn't adhere to the idea that feedback is a gift and that feedback is something that can make them better. So, but I would also use the same kind of techniques that I use in some of these other tips, making sure that you're sitting with them one-to-one, making sure that you are, again, putting in the context that you want to help them be a better leader. And that you also that you think it will help the team overall, and trying to give, again, very specific examples of, so Jane, hey, in this particular meeting, you just were, it wasn't helpful that you were so emotional over the response that somebody gave, but giving me the specific thing that I can reflect on, I think is important. So again, kind of the same sort of thing, treat somebody with respect, making sure that you're doing it kind of one-to-one, and then, again, trying to be as concrete in your examples as possible, because everybody really responds better to facts as opposed to generalizations.
Awesome. Thank you, Jane. And we have time for a couple more questions here. So if you have any last questions, please send those through the chat interface. So one question here for you. What do you do if you're giving feedback and someone gets emotional?
So that's happened a lot to me, and I think, again, it is something, especially when you're giving feedback, that's difficult for someone to hear. What I suggest is that you give them a break. That instead of sitting there with somebody who might be crying or being, in some way could be emotional in terms of becoming defensive or in some way combative, what I would say is, hey, let's just take a break from this, and why don't we get back together, tomorrow, and we can revisit it. But don't make them sit there and sort of feel like, make them even more uncomfortable or making them feel even worse about the situation. I think as the more senior person, giving them permission to take a break, to maybe even, leave the office for a while if that's where you're having the discussion. But again, I think you want to respect that everybody responds to feedback in a different way. And if you are emotional, it is going to be very hard for that person to get out of that if they're still sitting there in the office with you and you're just reminding them of a couple things that they haven't done very well. So give somebody space to be able to walk away and come back when they've been able to collect themselves.
Wonderful, thank you. And last question here. So how do you ensure that the feedback you're giving to an individual was heard, and as opposed to they just take it and don't do anything with it?
That is a great question, because it's both being heard and being, there's a nuance on that, which is, did they hear what you say, and then did they really hear what you said, or what did they take away from it? What I would do in any situation where you're giving somebody feedback is to ask them to come back to you in a couple of days with some kind of a plan. Again, I think doing a follow-up meeting, so that gives a chance for someone to absorb the information, and then to be able to play it back to you and how that turns and what they're going to do differently or the same. But coming back with a plan, that way you can really ensure that they did hear what you said and that they're going to be doing something about that. And then again, depending on the person, and this is, why feedback can be so helpful, is if you came back to me with a plan, and I want you to be successful, I'd say, well, let's put together a timetable on this. So if these are the couple things you're going to do, let's put some checkpoints together over the next couple of weeks or months to make sure that we're really, that we're both on the same page on this, and make sure that, that you're making the effort to make some changes or address an issue. I want to make sure as your superior that I'm aiding you in any way that I can. And so thinking about feedback as being not, it's all on the shoulders of the person who got the feedback, But in fact, if I am giving it kindly and I am caring about your success, making sure that we're working on a plan together. And I think, again, always having a plan and also having very concrete goals in terms of time frame of when you're going to check back really, really helps. And it makes it real versus just kind of blah, blah, blahing about something and let's just forget about it. It's not that important. I think having a plan with a timeline is a really critical thing to make sure that you're indicating that you heard the feedback and you want to do something about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you so much for this great information that you shared with us today. Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. Just a reminder that later today, you will receive a link to this recording along with a survey link. And to view upcoming webinars and request previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/alumni/webinars. On behalf of the Leeds School of Business, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and go Buffs!